I'm Kelly Gifford. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Engagement and Planning here at the ICA. I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you very much for coming down tonight. I'm here to introduce Abbott Miller, partner of Pentagram, who is leading the Artist Voice series tonight. The Artist Voice series is a lecture series that we do which highlights the creative process of today's leading artists and designers. For over a year now, Abbott has been working closely with us to create the new visual identity for the ICA. We did our homework and we interviewed a lot of brand agencies. We were drawn to Pentagram for a number of reasons. Their vibrant and creative designs, their incredible roster of clients, but most importantly, it was really Abbott. From the first meeting with him, he just got us. He knew where we wanted to go, who we were, and what we wanted to be as an institution. Abbott will share with you tonight his creative process in creating the brand, which I hope you love, and I hope you live tweet about and Instagram madly tonight. I wanted to tell you a little bit about Abbott's work before we get started. He's a designer, author, and educator. He joined Pentagram's New York office in 1999, and he's won numerous awards and medals, including medals from the Society for Publication Designers and the first annual Chrysler Award for Innovation and Design. Abbott has co-authored 4 books, including the influential publication, Design Writing Research, Writing on Graphic Design. He also teaches at the Graphic Design Department at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. I'd like to thank Abbott and his team for all of their work with the ICA, but I would also like to thank the institution, especially Jill Medvedow, the Ellen Matilda Post Director of the ICA, as well as the Board of Trustees, for their continuous support and creative input on this project. Lastly, I'd like to thank the marketing team for their endless dedication. Colette Randall, Ami Purana, Kate McBride, and Chris Walton. Without them, this project would have never happened either. So with that, I'd like to invite Abbott up to the stage.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. Kelly mentioned the process, and it's really been sort of exemplary in my mind, and at least in my experience. The way that the staff worked on the project, the way that the board was involved, the whole process was actually as wonderful as it could have been. So what I wanted to do tonight was just show you a little bit of the background and also obviously show you the identity, but put a little bit of the context around the project. We were tasked with this idea of developing a new visual identity. The impetus was really that there's a benchmark, the 10th anniversary, but also the opening of the watershed. And so it was an opportunity to also create a stronger identity that really linked all of the possible expressions of the ICA. And I think that although there was an existing identity system, it really didn't provide as much of an overall umbrella to organize all the visual expressions. So a big part of this was the sort of a special importance of linking the expressions in the galleries, in advertising, on the website, and social media. And that's really a new paradigm, even though it was just 10 years ago. The balance of these expressions has kind of tilted towards the digital. But we also think that the system really allows for an experiential contact with the ICA that is unusual. So I'm starting in a funny way. I'm showing you the identity first, and then I'm going to talk about how we got there. So that's the form. And excuse the portentous music, but it is an unveiling. So One of the things that we were really keen on was making a truly adaptable design language for the ICA. So a lot of configurations are possible with this sort of landmark of the ICA monogram and the possibility of how different ways that the signature locks up to it. I think the real life of this will be borne out in sort of successive years and instances. But in working with the team here, we really wanted to provide a lot of these different scalable entities, including this really small stamp-like mark. A lot of times the ICA identity will be center stage, the main thing that you're looking at. But most often it's really in the frame. It's sort of a voice that you're looking at other objects within. And the ICA obviously has most of its messaging built around other kinds of imagery. So that importance of this being both center stage but also marginal to the message is really important. So I'm going to show some applications, some of them real and some of them what we developed as we proved out the system. The ICA magazine was one of our test points, and we looked at different ways that it would appear with different imagery. The next issue will feature Diana Thader, who is the featured artist in the watershed. The interior, these are just a couple of glimpses at what that is starting to look like. And this will be one of the primary ways in which word gets out about the new identity, but also about all the new programming. Its presence was really important to us in terms of almost having nearly equivalent weight on ICA as a kind of speaker in the messaging around artists' exhibitions. So you're seeing a really strong presence for this because in our research, what we discovered is that people really are coming to the ICA because it's the ICA. It's almost taken on faith that there will be interesting shows. But the destination of the ICA and its voice as a powerful speaker in public context was really prominent in our minds as we thought about the scale of that ICA mark in various pieces like this. So we explored that with different artists, different voices, and keeping a brand approach that was really foregrounding the ICA. Digital and sort of the web presence, mobile, and iPad scales were a really important proving point for everything that we did. And as you can see in an image like this, the continuity across those things was really foremost in our minds. So ICA in the web context, these are just some sort of quick animations of what that looks like. And then in a in a mobile context, also having that sort of carry over and feel like the same place. You can see the avatar in the top. Color was a really interesting discussion for us. We have settled on kind of a core color group in the middle and a kind of a halo around. It's a pretty permissive system in terms of color, but you'll see a little bit later how we kind of divided out these kind of color zones for the different parts of ICA's program. But suffice to say, we think of it as a very black mark with white and color options. These are little interstitials that use the whole rainbow of colors and color on color options. We thought these would be nice elements to call people back into the auditorium at intermission, the way that it happens in sort of going to the opera or going to ballet. So we're starting to develop and produce a lot of the collateral materials like the shopping bags, t-shirts, and I'm just kind of going quickly through some animated sequences just to show that we've been kind of doing ICA merchandise for months now. So we sort of have a lot of notebooks, we have a lot of t-shirts, but in doing these things, we're really testing out color, materiality, and also the presence of the signature, that these are two scalable elements that can kind of work together, work in tandem. Color, as I mentioned, is really an important piece of the program, and we have explored that in a lot of these different contexts. The tote bags are a study unto themselves, very important, and some of them are underway. So The amazing thing about working with the ICA is that it has an incredible museum shop. And so these pieces actually have a really important role in the kind of promotional life of the institution. I think some museums do a more passive job with their kind of merchandising, but because ICA does such a wonderful job with it, that seemed like an especially important context for us to look at. So coffee cups, mugs, different colors, different interiors, and the world of banners. Nothing in the cultural world happens without banners happening, so we wanted to explore that as well. Hats was a specific request, especially that little fisherman's hat that you just saw, which is my first sort of fisherman hat version for any museum. Pencils and the little tags that you get as you come in, and umbrellas. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we got from what you saw, how we arrived what you just saw, and when we began. It was slightly over a year ago that we started, and with a lot of processes, it felt a little bit like this, like a lot of exploration at the beginning. We showed 3 directions to the museum. Fairly quickly, kind of rallied around the stencil version that you saw. And I think that that discussion was actually really enlivened by the fact that we did a series of brand workshops that I'll tell you about. The process that I'm laying out now sort of looks very even and steady. It actually transpired over multiple meetings here at the ICA with a lot of different people. But I'll talk a little bit about the context, because for us, it's always important that we kind of know the sort of history of the institution, and both its graphic history, but also the institutional culture. So the Boston Museum of Modern Art was established in 1936, and already in this sort of early phrase was seen as a kind of offspring of the Museum of Modern Art, maybe a renegade, but nonetheless kind of defined in relation to MoMA. The museum changed its name in 1948 to the Institute of Contemporary Art, and I think by doing that, that shift was really about saying that we're really focused on art of the present, and that was part of the museum's original mission. It was almost a clarification to change the name. And it also said to the Museum of Modern Art, you may be modern, but we're contemporary. So I think that was a kind of indicative of the culture of the institution. A lot of our projects really dig into the history, visual history, and sometimes you find amazing things that actually inform what you're doing. In this case, there was a kind of a loose accumulation of things that didn't actually add up to a particularly rich story. Museum branding is something that has kind of gained force over the last 20 years, 30 years even. But most institutions don't have what you would call a coherent identity that stretches back to 1946 or 1959. So the biggest anchor for us was really where we were just coming from, which was 2006, the new building by Diller, Scofidio, Renfro, and the designed monogram, the new identity by Wolf Olins. That was developed in tandem with a strategic positioning called the Brink, which related both to the visual characteristics of the building, the idea that it's sort of poised on the edge of the water, that it's sort of tumbling into the harbor, but also the idea of a cutting edge institution. So the idea of the Brink bringing you to the edge was very much part of both the building as well as the identity in my mind. There was a kind of 10 years of graphic development around that, including signage around the building and the website. I always liked the mark. I felt, though, that it had a really strong kind of retail sensibility, that it felt more corporate than cultural. But I do think that it had a kind of integrity. So as we thought about revising this and moving into the future, it was sort of an interesting dilemma. A lot of institutions go from something that's remarkably weak and then kind of move into a stronger phase. This is strong. So there was sort of an interesting benchmark there to consider. There's also this, which is sort of a problem. And a lot of people don't know this supermarket called IGA, but it's in 30 different countries around the world. And maybe if you don't even know it, that sense that I had that this was a very retail feel, kind of a very corporate brand, I think comes from that almost like classic quality that you see in the IGA supermarket mark. So the other context that we looked at, and I think this was important for us, was to look at what's the context that it will live in locally and then even nationally. So we looked at, the ecosystem of identities that we had to consider at the local level within Boston, but then broaden that out to also look at the cultural attractions that were in a slightly bigger framework in the sort of Northeast. And that was really just a little bit of a benchmarking. And then looking at peers for the ICA around the country, like-minded institutions of similar collections, and just doing a survey of that world of how do we look when we look just within the context of art museums. Whoops. And then looking internationally at, again, institutions of similar sensibilities, focusing on contemporary art. So the peculiar thing is that there are actually a lot of ICAs. And ICA Boston was the first, which is great. But the phrase Institute of Contemporary Art has actually proliferated since the time of the founding here. I think one reason is that it's sort of less heavy than the word museum. It actually sort of suggests something a little bit alternative to museum. But also I think the ICA Boston has been a leader for a long time, and also the ICA in London is another compelling precedent. And the fact that those two institutions create really positive sort of reference points has led to the phrase actually being kind of the dominant alternative when you want to say you show contemporary art. So there's the one in London, the one in Philadelphia, there's one in Portland, Maine. There, I think, was one in Baltimore. I don't think it's there. I haven't found it. Miami just recently opened, and Richmond, Virginia has a new Institute of Contemporary Art that's part of the Virginia Commonwealth University. And I think the most recent is the ICA LA. And that mark, the yellow mark, was designed by the artist Mark Bradford. So that was something we really had to contend with. We had to think about that when not that people go shopping and say, I want that ICA, but just that the expression needed to be distinct from these others. So a little bit more background that was influential for us in our thinking about the sensibility of the new identity. If you look in the middle here in this survey of age groups that visited the museum or visited various museums, the Institute of Contemporary Art has a proportionally very large number of millennials who are visitors, especially in relationship to other museums. It's your sort of most visited group age-wise. That told us that the sensibilities, the sort of focus for a lot of the branding that we're working on is really aimed at relatively young people, which is a great thing for the museum. The other thing I mentioned earlier was that attendance is really driven by the ICA as a destination in its own right. There isn't a whole lot of responsive attendance surges in relation to exhibitions, which told us one of the reasons why it informed our thinking about the ICA needing to be a real leader in all of the messaging. There's almost a quality of people taking it on faith that the ICA is going to do amazing shows. But it also means that people are going here as an incredible destination to see the art, to be on the edge of the water, to see an amazing building. So all of those things say that the institution is the hero to a degree that's a little bit unusual with a lot of art museums in particular. So the qualities that make this a worthwhile visit and a place that you want to return to, tourist destination, are kind of the evergreen aspects of the interiors, the building itself, and of course the views back out. An interesting thing percolating behind all of this is that the boundaries between traditional definitions of culture and popular entertainment are undergoing radical blurriness, dissolution. There's an annual study that has a website that's quite interesting called Culture Track that's done by a group called LaPlaca Cohen that looks at kind of trends in museums and cultural attractions. And their research this year showed a kind of progressively narrowing gap or a narrowing sort of boundary between things that we typically think of as popular entertainment and museum culture. So the gray bars are basically what we kind of tend to think of as formal cultural attractions, cultural destinations. The pink is really this sort of new breed of things that are kind of remarkably close in people's minds, so that a street festival or a food and drink experience is not so far away from going to an art museum as an experience. And what also the study tracked is why people go in the first place. And those are actually remarkably close. So the notion that there's a kind of top-down model, you go to a museum because it's good for you, or you are going because you need to be educated, is really getting kind of generalized into a whole host of things of feeling engaged, feeling social, having fun, being around other people. The Museum of Ice Cream kind of made a big debut in this study. This is basically a pop-up shop that I think is interesting because it sort of shows that the incredible success of this. It was in the top 10 of all top 10 museums in Instagram last year, ranking with the Louvre and the Prado and the Met. You know, it's sort of like, come on. It's basically a sort of a place to go take selfies. And it's hugely successful. It's been franchised around. So that's kind of interesting that museums, I think, are looking at broader cultural trends, the connection to entertainment. This place is suddenly saying museums are actually a kind of interesting legitimation of what is essentially a pop-up shop. So the boundaries are actually kind of going both ways. We're seeing a kind of unusual merging of the art world, the design world, the museum world, and Disney World, which I don't think is bad. I think it's actually what we're talking about now when we talk about museums. So a little bit about identity. The famous designer Paul Rand once said, "A good logo provides the pleasure of recognition and the promise of meaning," which I love because I think when you talk about what does a logo mean, it's really hard to like narrate it and like think of it as basically a box that you put all of these thoughts in and then they get transmitted out the other end. So this notion of a promise of meaning, that there's something about the mark that actually connects and makes people connect the mark with the institution, is I think the process of logo design, but also the reception and kind of the life of a logo. So as Paul Rand also said, it's really only with this association with a place like ICA or corporation or service that it takes on any real meaning. So it's really a container for those associations. It's also something that happens over time. So that is sort of, one sort of has to be mindful of the kind of the future life, that it really starts to take on meaning months and years into the process. So when we think about identity, we really think hard about the longevity, stylistic longevity, that it also feeds into the adaptability. So my beef with the ICA, IGA kind of mark, the previous one, was that it lays there sort of and is stamped on multiple things. It doesn't get under the skin of a lot of communications. It's always on the surface as a kind of emblem, just over and over and over. So this notion of adaptability and the life that the mark needs to have was something that we thought about in developing the ICA look that we now have. Just a few projects that I wanted to share that had a different kind of development that was also looking at this notion of longevity. When I designed the identity for the Guggenheim, I really wanted to find the kind of DNA in the lettering on the Frank Lloyd Wright building. To me, it was this totally overlooked visual asset that was sort of like passed down from Frank Lloyd Wright. So I worked with a type designer named Jonathan Heffler and developed a kind of full service font so that the DNA of Frank Lloyd Wright kind of lived through the mark. And this has kind of ultimate flexibility because it really is just lettering. And this happens to be the particular emblem that is there, but almost all communications for the museum are voiced in this way. And it, as a result, has a kind of adaptability to different conditions. The virtue of a single artist museum like Noguchi meant that actually our formal development could really specifically connect with the formal vocabulary of the artist. And this lettering really, to me, voiced a kind of quality that you see in Noguchi's work that is modern, but also has this organic quality. And again, the versatility of that and the kind of almost sort of non-screamy nature of it, I think has served them well, that the mark can be the mark and it can also just live as lettering. And one last project just on sort of precedence, the Barnes collection in Philadelphia has this completely specific visual culture thanks to the way that Dr. Barnes installed the artwork in his private museum, which is now public. And what I wanted to do with this particular identity was to connect Dr. Barnes to all the work that's shown there. His artwork, in a sense, was arranging these works of art into what he called ensembles. So this is one of Dr. Barnes's notes about what to hang where. And he created a dialogue between these paintings, and that was his artwork. So I kind of felt like we had a responsibility to refer to that tradition in the particular way that he thought about the collection and hung it. So we took a particular ensemble, which has the Matisse in the center, and created the geometry of the mark around that, scaled it down, and then brought in his name. And the interesting thing to me is that that's the game that Dr. Barnes played over and over in 27 galleries on 4 different walls of each room, was the dialogue between different works of art on the wall. So that kind of became a graphic emblem for the institution. So back to ICA, what was interesting here was not beginning with the iconography of a building, which I felt like had been done before, but really beginning with the strategic plan called A Radical Welcome. And I think that all of that work preceded our involvement, and it was really our duty to kind of think through it, what it meant for the institution. So the idea of the Radical Welcome was being open, inclusive, engaging, setting a new plan for moving forward with the new watershed, but also with this 10-year benchmark for this building. The phrase was inspired by the playwright Anna Devere Smith, who referred to hope, radical hospitality, and kindness. And what that really boiled down to was this notion that it's not just an art museum. It is a gateway to art, to the broader rubric of creativity and community. And that is a very different model of what an art museum is, really, that it is as socially engaged, and it is a kind of, a sort of a forum that is broadly about creativity. I think the ICA can do that, especially because of the link to this theater and the performing arts and music and dance. So it's a lofty goal that they can actually live up to. One of the things that was really great about this process was that we worked with one of the advisory board members, Stephanie Connaughton, who did workshops with the staff and with the board to really describe attributes of the ICA, which helped really set the groundwork for our project. And she looked at what she called brand essence, image, and values. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but basically it was a day-long ideation of what are the characteristics of the ICA, that it's creative, that it's transformative, that it's alive, it connects people, it's emotional, it's confident, smart, bold, provocative. All of these things kind of went into our thinking. Visual characteristics, that it's sort of dynamic, it's immersive, it's sort of all of these things, but also one that really is ultimately about the social experience people have when they come here. So I think that this idea of the global gateway, a kind of connective, experiential, transformative place was topmost in our minds. What we resolved that into was basically 3 statements: that the ICA connects artists and audiences, it connects art and performance, and it connects the city and ideas. And that was really gave us kind of our starting point. The next question is form. How do you say some of those things or create a container where those things start to make sense? I use this illustration because for designers and people involved with lettering and typography, ICA is actually a truly challenging group of letters. And I illustrated that difficulty with this historic typeface or lettering system based on human form. But the I is basically this sort of column. The C is this like letter form that is widely open, kind of gesturing towards the A, which is leaning away. So there's actually some challenging physical things about it. In some ways, it's a kind of classic Bauhaus circle, square, triangle series, which also doesn't really want to sit next to each other very happily. So, oops, I'm having that problem that PJ mentioned. So if you look at the letter forms, they are some of the most constant letter forms in the alphabet. So most A's are like remarkably similar unless you go to sort of a slab serif. Most C's have the same kind of repetition of form. Even A is a really kind of recalcitrant letter form. There isn't a lot of range in these particular very iconic letter forms. So if you look at this series and you pay attention to the way that the C relates to the I, you see a lot of the same problems occurring over and over, where there's this sort of unfortunate gap between the C and the A, a kind of heavy black space in the middle of the C. And even with this, the problem that we had less than purely formal considerations was just that every time we used a kind of traditional letter form construction, they look like other ICAs, and they looked sort of, they recalled these other instances. When we turned to the form of a stencil, it really started to deconstruct that thing into a different ensemble of elements in a really positive way. And we kind of rallied around the notion that there's something wonderful about this kind of perceptually engaging kit of parts construction. So there is this sort of visual quality to this that we felt was very iconic, but there's also a kind of picture going on with stencils. It is a very approachable kind of mark making, letter making. It has a kind of rootedness in a lot of familiar ways of message making. It has a great history within the history of modern and contemporary art, from Marcel Broodter's to Picasso and Braque to Jasper Johns and Christopher Wool. We loved all of these associations, that it was familiar, everyday, accessible, crafted, even that it had a slightly nautical vibe being here on the waterfront. And of course, the ready-made as a kind of form in contemporary, in modern art, was also appealing. So my last word is gestalty, which I made up. But gestalty, in my terms, means that it is involved, it's almost perceptually engaging. You have to put it together in your brain, much the way Gestalt psychologists looked at how people perceive things, so that these kit of parts elements make more sense as a whole, that they relate to each other, and that it's an ensemble, to quote Dr. Barnes. So we really thought of this sort of anchor, the kind of bookends, these two formal things, the institute on the one hand and art on the other. And in between is what is contemporary. Things that are contemporary are always in flux. It's always relative. And so that idea of the sea as the connecting point and that brought these two things together became very appealing to us. Now, I know people on the street, people who aren't hearing my talk about this, don't make those sort of mental leaps. But for us, the kind of storytelling within it is still valid. And that idea of connecting a kind of, almost giving it an eccentricity, that it wasn't just ICA, but there's something going on with the word contemporary, not to lessen the importance of solving this spatial challenge of getting a kind of evenness of color across these three letter forms. So we looked as, is there a problem externally? Are we, stepping on anyone's toes formally? And we looked around commercially in the sort of corporate and retail world, a little bit of the cultural world. We made sure that in the art context that we weren't stepping on anyone's toes or kind of getting scooped by someone else. And we felt like we were sufficiently distinct in that territory as well. So to turn away from the sort of focus on the logo, I want to talk just a little bit about the system itself, which is actually more than a logo. It's a visual sort of story that uses type and color, spatial relationships. It's really a set of tools that the team here at the ICA will be using for years going forward that really has to anticipate a lot of the different needs that the museum has. I mentioned that the museum has, for a long time, had amazing programs that are core to its identity, both the theater work, but also the Teens program, which is a national leader in that area, and now the Watershed coming on board. So there are a lot of sort of sub-elements that needed to get a viable and connected expression that we've resolved with a really simple sort of nomenclature system that relates typographically very strongly. I mentioned color and how the color aspect is starting to live in certain territories. All of these colors are part of the system, but we started to like the idea that programming for teens would take on a certain zone of the colorways. The live programs would live in a sort of stronger color character, and the kids programs would be softer. So we created these little interstitials that really run through the color languages for each of those programs. So live has its own color culture within the system, and they all share the same sound. So this is sort of the live color spectrum. These are some of the pieces that we were generating for the live brochures, and what's underway that will be coming up soon. So those are those colors within that part of the system. For kids, I mentioned already the sort of softer palette, and I think that the way that these get developed will start to clarify these kind of chapters within the program. We commissioned a great illustrator named Marion Bizet to do illustrations of the building that are working in tandem with the colorways. And I'm really liking the feel of these things and the way that they soften a pretty tough building and make it more toy-like. So these are different uses of water in relation to the building. And then for teens, what we introduced was patterns as one of the distinguishing features for the teens programs. So it's color and pattern working in tandem. So these are some of the printed pieces for that, and then promotion. So Watershed is the new featured thing that is opening, I think it's the 18th, is that right? July 4th. We're doing the brand on the 18th, right? So Watershed is an important new destination for visitors to the ICA. And it really, through a lot of thinking about this, realized that it has to convey the kind of, rootedness in the ICA experience. So it is always the ICA watershed, and that it takes, it needs equal, if not greater attention on the ICA part of that message. It's too tough to separately brand an institution, and really it's an extension of the experience people have here. So we're working right now. The signage is going up imminently, and will maybe be visible, maybe not, from all the way across the water. But I think this is a super exciting project here. And banners around the building will be also announcing that hierarchy of message. And we're starting now, we've designed most of this already, but as a project, we're turning back to it to begin implementing interior signage for this building that is using the same typography system in new signage that is more strongly connected to the new brand. So these will be going on soon as a project. And we have also worked with Diller Scofidio Renfro on how to make the new mark kind of live and feel very integral to the building. So because of the faceted verticals, we're kind of embracing that quality by breaking the mark up. And I think it'll be beautiful in the day and beautiful at night because it will be backlit at night. And that integration of the kind of striations will really help make it feel like it's part of the glass rather than just plastered on top. So the other new thing is that we are newly aware of the ride back from the watershed as an opportunity to connect this in people's minds, to talk to tourists who happen to be out on the water, and to use the opportunity that all the other big buildings around you are taking, which is that they're all branded, they all have type on them, so why shouldn't we? And to really get the message out there that that wonderful building is the ICA. So I just want to say thanks before we see if there are questions to the board, to Jill, to Kelly, to everybody on the branding team, that it's been a really fantastic experience for us. I also want to just say thanks to my team who have been in the trenches all along. This is them. They're back in New York, but I rely greatly on them and their enthusiasm. And then see if, I think Kelly is going to possibly ask questions. Thank you. Actually.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great.
Thanks.
So I'd love to open it up for questions from anybody in the audience. If anybody has anything that they'd like to ask Abbott or me, hopefully Abbott. Hi.
I would like to know how did it come about that there was a need for new branding?
I'm just going to repeat everybody's
From the
question.
ICA.
So the question is, how did it come about that we decided that we needed new branding from the old ICA logo and brand identity to what we're at now? After you.
Well, I can say that I think that the sort of impetus was really the new positioning, that the Brink positioning felt, I think, sort of culturally very specific to the initial phase with the new building, and that really there's a new attitude afoot at the museum, and the desire to kind of connect things graphically to that. I think also a really important thing is just that the previous brand identity didn't actually have the hallmarks of a thorough, all-embracing identity program. So I think it was a desire to connect a lot of the things happening digitally and in publications and in the experience of the building itself. So our involvement is really stretching across all of those things, including signage, including the design of screen graphics, But the museum had its own reasons, right?
We also, the original Wolf Olins branding was developed before the building was even finished being built or open. So that identity really did connect to the building, like a new building on the waterfront. Since that time, we've had 10 years, and we've really become a thought leader with incredibly nationally recognized programs, from our exhibitions to our performances to our nationally renowned teen arts program. So we really felt we wanted to take this moment and really recognize the work that we've done through our curators, our director of performance, our director of education, and really celebrate the programming and the people that we've reached since we've opened. And it really felt like this was the time, after 10 years of building that nationally renowned programming, and as we were about to open the ICA watershed, to really kind of shift and to think about how we can extend the engagement we believe in with contemporary art even to wider audiences. Sure. Hi, yes.
You showed one slide of a whole bunch of ICA logos from this country and international.
Yeah.
And almost all of them had the city as part of the logo or design. Why did you intentionally leave out Boston?
I'll just repeat the question. So the question is, why did we intentionally leave off Boston from the logo? I'll start and then you can
Sure.
take it over. So the current ICA logo, the Wolf Olins logo, the red logo does have a lockup where the full institution's name is with it, but because of that stamp and that mark, they typically have to be separated. We actually felt really strongly that we wanted to include Boston with this logo because we feel like the work that we've done in Boston with our programming is really seen across the country, and we are seen as a thought leader. So although Abbott was showing the logo just with the 3 letters, that mark, our intention is to always include the full name Institute of Contemporary Art Boston with that mark.
Yeah, so the system really does have a range of lockups that have the full signature. It was interesting to me that we explored different possibilities where Boston was actually brought higher up in the hierarchy. And I think a lot of people felt like that was just not appropriate or interesting or useful. That really the sort of full signature was the place for that to live, but not in the core ICA emblem. So in some ways, they're fairly consistent from the previous mark to this mark in terms of that sort of pairing of an icon with a signature.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, what unique aspects of this institution, or what essence of this institution did you pull from, and how did that sort of come through in the identity system?
Okay, so what essence from the institution did you pull from, and
Yeah.
how did that come through the
Well,
identity?
It's a really good question because in some ways the spirit of the institution is crystal clear to me in terms of the persona, all those attributes that we talked about. The interesting thing, like I showed the Guggenheim, which I felt like was sort of like very clearly, there was such a clear path from you should look like this, you should look basically like Frank Lloyd Wright. Noguchi was like, you should look like Noguchi. The Barnes was a kind of almost a narrative emblem. For the ICA, it was really very different. To me, it really began with this notion of, it's almost the rubric of art in the most abstract, in the most sort of general terms, that art and creativity is really kind of what, to me, is behind the mark. That makes it slightly more general than sort of saying this is a sort of a unique graphic or spatial artifact that I saw when I was at the ICA. And I think that that's actually, for me, what makes it really interesting is that it's talking back out to the world generally about art making and creativity. I was happy that when we thought about how to unite it with the building, that it actually played very well, even though it didn't begin at that place. And in some ways, the way that the Wolf Olins mark lived on the building was almost my biggest case study for what I thought was not successful about it. So I think for me, it's almost like it's a parallel expression of the ICA. One hopes that those connections deepen over time, but it's not that I can say in the way that I can say with the Barnes, like, look, that's the ensemble.
I have time for 2 more questions, so I'm going to go way up top right there. Yep, you, yep.
Yeah. Right, right.
Yes. Did
Yeah,
you
so
think about the connection?
Yeah, we did actually. And I kind of hesitate to narrate a lot of that because I feel like it's sort of like trying to shove more stories into it, but we really did. And I hope that, I'm really happy to hear you say that because
I am too.
it's sort of, we actually did talk about that, and there's a way in which it's as elemental as A is for art, and the kind of almost storybook, it's almost like a rebus, like I see art. So I think all of that kind of almost playing with the primitive nature of stencil lettering was also appealing. Thank you.
All right, one more. I feel really bad because lots of hands are up. I'm going to go right there.
Maybe it's the narrative you presented it in, but you said basically you sort of settled on this and then looked at other precedents in Home Depot.
Yeah.
If you had found something that
We would be really disturbed.
Wait, you have to let me
Oh, I'm
say it.
sorry.
The question was that you looked at different logos with a stencil form, and what would you have done if you had found one that wouldn't have allowed you to move forward, or what would that have been?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of your professional obligation, and there's always moments, like I showed the IGA thing, and it's sort of like, nah, 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 there's always gonna be something out there that is annoyingly similar in some way. So we thought if we just looked at the kind of retail world and then look at the art context, that was kind of that was a first level of research to do. If we had found that kind of similarity, we would have brought it to you as an issue. And so in our process, we developed 3 entirely distinct options. We settled around that, but then we kind of did the due diligence part where we went out and sort of did visual research to make sure, and also with our client kind of feel like they feel secure in that and feel like all of those associations are acceptable, in the final mark.
All right, I'm sorry, I do have to wrap it up. I would just like to thank Abbott Miller for spending
Thank
so much
you.
time with us, and I'd like to thank all of you.